Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. In today's video we will go through unit tests versus end-to-end tests and why Cypress is actually great for both. I mean, you probably know what a unit test is. A unit test is something that actually encapsulates the smallest unit possible of your app or project that you're testing. That could either be a simple function or a class with dependencies that you would either mock yourself or use some kind of testing framework to mock the dependencies of your class. Within a E2E test, or also referred as a functional test, and sometimes also called UI test, you would use some automation tool to help you click through your application like the user would do and set up your application state and then do some assertions on that application state. Throughout the rest of the series, I will just stick with E2E tests instead of UI tests or functional tests, since that is the most common one I've found. So apparently an E2E test is awesome, right? It does catch every error since it's the same as the user would do on your website, right? Well, the answer is no, and there are not only performance implications behind this. Unit tests usually execute a lot faster, and they also provide a more encapsulated test that you can easier maintain, at least kinda, you know. E2E tests, on the other hand, are kinda slow. They are pretty hard to maintain since the UI can quite often change, and you might even have features on that do A and B testing, and then you might have to do different tests for your different UI states and a lot of that funky stuff that you can do. Unit tests also are kind of great when it comes to test-driven development if you are into that kind of stuff. With a test-driven development, you would usually write your test first and then afterwards write your code. With a E2E test, you usually don't do this because you don't know what your UI will end up like, and elements might move around and things are more eager to change. Therefore, it's more easier to do this kind of test-driven development style within a unit test. But E2E tests do have their advantages because, yeah, they do test the whole application state. That means they do communicate with the database layer, for example, or the caching layer, your messaging queue layer, whatever you are using. And therefore, you would ensure that everything kind of works together. You could, if you would like to, and sometimes this is useful, mock or stop your application layer, your database layer, I mean. You could stop those away. Like, sometimes it's useful to stop your application layer, your database layer, or whatever you're using away and just rely on your application state or UI state. But in most cases, you would want to ensure that everything works together. So now you might ask yourself, when should I choose a unit test and when should I choose an E2E test? The answer isn't that simple, but in most cases, it will be the best to put as much as possible in your unit tests and later just try to see what is missing and what could go wrong in the composed application state and write an E2E test for that. Did you actually know that you can test DOM events and DOM elements in general in your unit tests as well? And you don't always need an E2E test for that. Let's have a look at an example for that. This time we are in a different environment. Instead of our previous React Calculator app, we are now in an Angular application, just to show you another framework. And this demo application is really pretty simple. We do have a counter text that increases on this button click. And we are going to assert that this works by using a unit test. We could do this with a Cypress test, but I want to show you that it's not always useful to use a Cypress full spec test, since it does have to launch a browser, it does have performance implications, and using your UI to always set up a state isn't always the best way to test something and the most performant thing to do. Because we do want to have those E2E tests, but we don't want to use them for everything, when something like a unit test could also provide the same test functionality. Yeah, let's get ahead and go into our IDE. We do have a simple HTML template here. We do have a counter value in a span tag inside of a p tag, and we do have a button here. I'm going to demonstrate you two ways to actually select elements that could either be by using direct CSS selectors or by adding a data testing ID or data automation ID. Just add some kind of data tag to your elements that you want to test, so you can easily select those elements and have a more unique identifier for those elements. You could also use CSS IDs, but those might be used for something else. Therefore, a data testing ID or data automation ID could be pretty useful. All right, so let's head into our little unit test. It is pretty simple. We are in an Angular context. I don't have to explain everything, I guess. We are setting up our unit test here with the testbed and configure our little module by declaring our component. We don't have any kind of dependencies. It is just a simple demo application. We need to write a simple specification here. We're gonna say it should increase the counter on button click and pass in a closure. Inside here, we first have to select our element like we would do in Cypress or with Cypress by using our fixture here that Angular provides us. In other frameworks like React, for example, this would work a little bit different. So yeah, it depends on your use case, but there are always solutions for this kind of stuff. In Angular, you would use the fixture.debug element, which provides the root element of our component that is being tested. And we're going to say query, and we do have to add a predicate. For selecting by CSS selectors, Angular provides us a by function or class, and we can say by CSS. This comes from the platform.browser package, and we can specify our selector in here. We want to first select our button. So it is a button, and it does have a data testing ID, which equals increase button, I guess. We're gonna confirm that now. It does have increase button. Okay, so we selected our element, and then we're gonna call the native element property on it and gonna say click. We're going to test if the selection part actually works. We're not gonna have any kind of assertions, but otherwise we would get an error. We need to create a little new terminal window here and gonna say ng.test or ng-test. This will boot up the unit test runner, Karma in this case, and we don't see any kind of errors for now. Therefore, yeah, it should be quite good. Back into our code, and we're gonna do the same thing with the button. We're gonna have to say beforehand, before we select the button, we're gonna have to detect the changes, since we are in an Angular context and the change detection don't always runs. We do have to do that manually here in our unit test. Then we're going to select our text. We're gonna say debug element query by CSS. In this case, we're just going to use the p tag, and inside there is a span tag. we need the native element here, and we going to store this reference just so that the line doesn't get too long. Const L equals, and then we're going to expect our element dot inner text to be, and we need a string here too. This is our little assertion. It will run, and we see already that it was successful if we look down here. But we can also confirm that by opening up our Chrome. And yeah, we see the state. It does have the current counter up to 2, and the test was successful. So just a quick little demonstration on how to use selections by CSS selectors in our unit test instead of writing a Cypress test for something like that. So Cypress is pretty great since it allows us to write unit tests and E2E tests from within the same runner or from within the same files, and allows us to just rely on one tool. Therefore, Cypress is pretty great. To sum this up, both unit tests and E2E tests are needed, and they do have their purpose. I would personally try to write as much as possible in unit tests, although I prior was a pretty big fan of E2E tests, since it's a lot easier, in my opinion, to test your application, and it's more like the user would do. I didn't always see the purpose of an unit test and was kind of against it, but I learned that unit tests can be a lot cheaper and can be a lot easier to work with. But that's it for this video. In the next video we will go through how to authenticate your user within a Cypress test.